I've done clergy misconduct, lots of work in this area. I added a couple of things to the policy once it was drafted based on my experience, and I just want to highlight a couple of things, and then I would really love to answer any questions that you might have that I can address. One of the things that I think is really important about this policy that you might not understand if you haven't done this work before is that we have specifically requested that if a person who has been an identified offender comes to the church, that they see a qualified therapist. So it's not good enough just to see a social worker or a psychologist. You actually need specialized training to be able to work with people who committed sexual offenses. And a part of that specialized training is to be able to create what we call internal and external barriers. It's quite similar to alcoholism, substance abuse in terms of it's a relapse prevention model. And one of the important things that always has to happen is that there are external barriers preventing that person from reoffending. One of the things that we know, and one of the reasons that I became involved in this project, is that when people have committed a sexual offense, whether they've been incarcerated or not, there is a very isolating experience, and recidivism increases in proportion to isolation. So one of the best mitigating factors that therapists and professionals have to prevent recidivism is for offenders to actually have a community. So that is one of the reasons that I think a policy like this is important. There are safe ways to have people who have committed offenses in the congregation, and part of that is by having a qualified therapist, having what will be a support team. Any qualified sex offender therapist will have the person in therapy with a support group, on-call team. The church team would be in addition to that person's individual on-call team. Everybody would know the triggers that would precipitate thoughts, feelings, or behaviors that would ultimately lead to violence. And this policy creates the external safety, people monitoring certain areas that might be off guard. Every person who struggles with this situation of offending other people is unique, and so you can't say blanket statements because whether the person, there's a different target for their victimology, there's different triggers, there's different things. And so what we do as a support team, whoever ends up being on the support team, is they're aware of all these things so that way they're not going in blind. It's not like you're just having the person there and you don't know anything about what triggers them or anything about their target population or their ideal victim or their, warning signs even. So this is a way. The fact is that offenders are all around us. When I was doing work with adults, I worked with an artist, I worked with a senator, I worked with a construction worker, I worked with a real estate officer, I worked with several ministers. So people are everywhere. This just allows us to actually track and provide those external barriers that keep everybody safe. So those were the things that I wanted to highlight about this policy, because I think it's hard to understand what the context of those external support, the significance of that. And as you see on the back, in some cases, there may even be a need for a one-on-one person to always have that person in their sight. So the group that is comprised of the people you see and trained liaisons, and I have volunteered to be a part of that training for liaisons and even to serve as a liaison. With my experience, those people will know what to look for. They'll be in contact with probation officers. They'll be in contact with therapists and psychiatrists. They'll be in contact with family members. So that way we're creating as safe a condition, really safer than out in public. When you're out in public, this would be a much safer situation. However, even saying that, I understand that 1 in 3 women and 1 in 5 men have been victims of abuse. And so this is a really, really triggering topic for people. It is hard to humanize someone when they have when you've had the experience of being objectified by someone in this situation. And so I am sensitive to that. I will be around after this forum if anybody needs to talk about anything that's coming up or any triggers that you're experiencing. And I think that's kind of what I wanted to say. And maybe I'll just open it up for questions, comments, thoughts, both about the experience of what might it look like or feel like or be like to have somebody in the congregation, and about the policy for the board members and Reverend Luke. Yeah.
So I'll grab another mic.
I'm Walt. At the end of the form, there are 4 spaces to list trained liaisons. And you touched on that, but I've got a couple questions. One is it necessary to define what that training is? And secondly, who decides what member of the community is eligible to sign as one of those liaisons?
Okay, I'm not going to answer the who decides. That's out of my realm, but I will answer the what is involved in training. So I haven't created, I volunteered to create this curriculum. I haven't done it yet, but I've trained many therapists under my supervision to work with sex offenders. So there are some basic concepts that apply no matter what the person's situation is. Part of that is the concept of relapse prevention. So I like to use this example. I have a sugar addiction and I love Girl Scout cookies. And so I actually had this, what we call seemingly irrelevant decision to sit at the table closest to the Girl Scout cookies. Now, if you didn't know that I had an issue with Girl Scout cookies and you said to me, that's interesting, you sat right by the Girl Scout cookies, and I could say, that was just an accident, like that doesn't mean anything. And maybe I might even think it doesn't mean anything. But the fact is, I chose to sit by the Girl Scout cookies. And so sometimes so think about what it would take for someone to overcome the societal taboo, the moral, taboo, knowing that they've hurt somebody. There's a lot of cognitive distortions that go into the mind of someone who commits a sexual offense. It's so taboo. There's a lot that goes into it. And if that person is, depending on where they are in treatment, they may or may not be self-aware of those cognitive distortions. So one of the things and reasons why the external committee is so important is to say, hey, I saw you sitting at a table with a child, and that's actually not a part of your safety plan. Oh, well, I just was stopping to say hi to blah, blah. Actually, there's no seemingly irrelevant decision. So part of what I would do, or I would suggest somebody do, is to introduce the concepts of relapse prevention that I've talked about a little bit, the concept of external, internal barriers, the concepts of cognitive distortions, so that way you had the language to be able to talk to the person who's committed the sexual offense, their therapist, and to hear what their language is. I mean, reputable therapists are going to use a cognitive behavioral relapse prevention model. And so you would need to understand what that was. Now, so there's some general education that would be super important. And then there's education about the specifics that that individual is dealing with. So what are their greatest triggers? For instance, for some people who commit sexual offenses, anger is a trigger. For some, sadness is a trigger. For some, loneliness or isolation is a trigger. And so you would need to know specifically So that way, let's say you see the person and you can tell they're mad. Well, that's a trigger. So you'd want to be able to intervene, say, hey, let's go talk, whatever. So you need to know some specific things, and you need to know some general things. So again, I don't have the curriculum developed yet. I could, and I will, if the board would like me to, but does that make sense that there's some concepts that are universal and then some very specific concepts to the people who might be involved? Now, as to who chooses who's on the team, I don't know that answer.
Right. Sure, and this one's good now, and that one can.
Okay, great.
Check, yeah. So if you, in the policy itself, you see that the initial team is myself, the Director of Faith Development, and Coordinator of Congregational Life. So currently, that's me, Amy Nelson, and Melissa Egler. We would be the first touch point to discern who else to reach out to. So we'd be the ones to decide, like, who do we, and probably in consultation with Terry, especially as if this policy was new, right, in these next several months or a year or whatever, and say, this is a situation we're facing. What resources do we need to reach out beyond ourselves and our own expertise to move forward in this process in a good way? So that's the short answer, is it ultimately falls to the three of us first. And then we did just change on that front page of the policy part in the draft. There was some place. I'll find it shortly after I stop talking, I'm sure.
While you're looking, can I say one other thing?
Please.
So in churches that I've worked with in the past, there's been a response team. So people are trained and then they're able to respond should someone seek. And it's really, I'm kind of going out on a limb here. It's not just about an offender coming into the congregation. It's about what if something happens within a family who's here, and there needs to be an immediate response of compassion for the alleged offender, for the alleged victim, for, siblings, for all of that. So this type of training would create, I call it a emergency response team. So my recommendation, which I'm just now saying, so I haven't talked to the board about this, would be that people are identified and trained so that way on a minute they could step in.
Great. Yeah, I was just going to say in that the risk reduction policy part, that where it defines team, it says other leaders as appropriate, and we made sure to add in some flexibility there, so it's not just assumed that that 3-person team is the end all be all, like that, or that's all that we can reach out to. Like, well, it says in the policy it's only the 3 of us, so that we reach out. But I love that idea of having a cohort ready, because it's also, I imagine, right, it's the potentiality of not just someone like coming to the church, identifying themselves, etc. It's people already within the community, perhaps, that you find out, or something happens, and then there's an offense situation that you need to deal with a known member of the community too. So there's a lot of different complexities and nuances there.
We would need enough people that we could pull on people who were not in the target victimology. So for instance, if the offender offended against adult women, we would need adult men. If the offender offended against young children, then that might be too triggering for someone who has young children. So we would want to really think about the mental health of both the people serving and of the needs of the person who's committed the offense based on their target victim profile.
I have 2 questions, but I'll ask the first one. So for folks who come in, are they, they would have to self-identify. Yes. So it is a self-identification. It's not like we're, looking at the sex registry every month and seeing if, if like people came in. So it's a self-identification.
It is a self-identification. I have also been in consulting roles before where I have flagged individuals for church leadership who I felt were acting inappropriately, and I was concerned about offending behavior or grooming behavior. So I think part of educating people about this issue is just helping people to be able to identify kind of because grooming, which is how an offender sets up a victim, looks like friendly behavior. It looks like helping. And so the only difference between grooming, making friends, or, getting trust, and being a friend is the intent. But there are ways to have some of us have intuitive warning signs, and there are ways to also train yourself to see warning signs.
Okay. And then this is specifically for sexual offenses, not people with like a violent history, correct? Like a non-sexual violence.
So I would,
I don't know.
posit that all sexual offenses are violent, whether they are.
Right. I'm just saying for folks that are violent without the sexual part of it. So like if someone is charged with different like aggravated assault and all of that, and maybe it's not to a partner or to someone they know it is to someone because they have anger issues. I'm thinking this is just the sexual violence.
It is just the sexual violence, and another policy could be taken. There would be different elements that would need to be included for violence that was outside of sexual violence, because there's different dynamics depending on what violent behavior is involved. Y'all didn't mean for this to cover?
No,
Yeah.
I don't think that was
Okay.
the intent.
Yeah, I was just.
Good question.
Yeah, it is a really good question. Thanks for helping with the mic.
It seems to me that organizations such as Boy Scouts and Catholic Church have run into problems by not being transparent about these individuals. So, and it's opened themselves to lawsuits. So how is the congregation, this church, going to handle that transparency versus the privacy of the individual?
The policy, let me answer from the policy, and then I'm going to answer from a global, applying the learnings from the Boy Scouts, the Catholic Church, the Methodist Church, like all over, happens everywhere. So the policy is very specific about having a team, and those are the people who receive disclosure about the person's offending history. Sometimes offenders decide to go public, and it just depends on where they are in their treatment journey. However, that would not be a completely unlikely thing to happen. I think that part of the risk assessment is the person safe being monitored by a few people? Now, that's not an assessment I'm going to make. That's not an assessment Melissa's going to make. That's not an assessment Luke's going to make. That's an assessment the therapist and the probation officer are going to make. And so if someone is at a high risk of offending, high enough risk that everybody would need to know, they would not be a person who would be a candidate to come to this congregation under this policy. So this policy, while it doesn't say explicitly is for low-risk offenders, we're talking about people who are out in the community, which means either that they've done prison time and they've been paroled, or that maybe they pled out and they didn't end up having prison time. In most cases, there's going to be a probation officer. In all cases, there will be a therapist. That's one of the conditions of this policy. So really, it would be up to the individual offender whether they wanted to share their experience with everybody. And as I said before, if it was a situation that the safety of the entire congregation was at risk, that would not be a situation that would apply here. Oh, and then your other question about the Catholic Church and the Methodist Church. So in the Boy Scouts, and so in those situations, leaders of the church or of the Boy Scouts were offending, and the organization was keeping it quiet. So I think that's a difference. They were in power, they were in authority over people, they had access to victims, there was not a safety plan. And then when churches or the Boy Scouts found out about it, there were no repercussions, there was no reporting, there was no transparency. They were just moved to other churches or other troops. And so I see that as a pretty significant difference. We're talking about an unidentified offender where the organization is complicit and covers it up versus an identified offender who has sometimes probation, all the time therapists. And so there's a support team around them. So it's kind of apples and oranges.
Okay, so what about a situation where somebody may be a victim of someone and they're a person who victimized them shows up at the church? And what if that person was never prosecuted? What if that person is not in therapy and they just walk in, and this could be a decade after the offense, and you just like, that person, what happens then?
Yeah, so that is a really, really good question. That is more likely to happen in a familial abuse situation. Although with stalkers, there's a chance that people could come in, in domestic violence situations. There's always that chance. Whether there's a policy or not, there's always that chance. And so in that situation, I think that the priority, and again, this is just me, Terry, talking, this is not the church talking, there would be an absolute priority to protect the safety and security of the victim. If someone's direct offender tried to come into this congregation, I would think that that would not be something that would be allowed to happen. Now, if they're unconvicted, if it's an allegation, I think that would have to be reviewed on a case-by-case basis. And we know that, I don't want to get into statistics about false reports because then that takes us down a whole different avenue. But I think if someone is publicly stating that they've been victimized by someone else, then it's probably in their best mental health interest to be believed. That is the way I approach situations as an advocate and therapist. I'm not an investigator. I don't have to determine whether it's the truth or not. I just can see the reality of the trauma that the person's experienced. So my advice to the church would be to defer to that reality and not worry about whether there's a piece of paper or you would be depressed if I told you how many assaults happened versus how many actually are taken through the legal system versus how many actually, it's maybe 2 or 3% are convicted out of 100% that happen.
And, the other thing I wanted to know is, currently we don't have a policy. And so people who are members of the church who have been victimized kind of can fool themselves into thinking, well, we don't have a policy that allows anybody to be here. And if this policy is put into place, then there will be a policy that allows sexual offenders to be here. And those church members may feel less welcome here and less safe here, just knowing that there is a policy that would allow somebody, and knowing that they would not know that there could be someone here who was a sex offender. So how can we craft this policy in such a way that that person is going to feel safe here?
That's the key question, isn't it? That's the crux of wrestling about how do you balance the values of the UU faith to respect people and to be a welcoming place with the feelings of people who have been victimized. So we know that 1 in 3 women and 1 in 5 men have experienced some kind of trauma, sexual trauma in their lifetime. And so there are a lot of people here who have been victimized. I also feel positive that there are people in this congregation who have victimized others, whether it's through child sexual abuse, domestic violence, or violence against women or violence against men. So statistically, as many people as we have people who have committed offenses in this congregation. And so I think that as a part of this policy going through, it would be really important for us, and I talked about this before the pandemic, but I'm going to mention it again, to provide some education, some support, some compassion and understanding to anyone who might feel uncomfortable. The reality is that it is safer to know that there's a group of people watching the person than just to have a random person wandering around. But it's about perception, it's about feelings, it's about trauma response, and those aren't always rational things. They're not rational feelings or beliefs. They're based on trauma. And so it's really important that that we support people who need trauma intervention, that we support people to provide accurate stories around what this policy means and what it doesn't mean, about the protections that are in place, about, all of these issues that I'm talking to y'all about. It's really important for people who have concerns to have access to information. And I think there can always be buddy systems. It doesn't have to just be with somebody who is coming in under this policy. If somebody is feeling uncomfortable here, we can create a buddy system. Or, there's just so many options that can happen to support people who have been victimized in this congregation, and probably should be happening in every congregation in the whole country. I know that, I used to do, I've worked in 6 cities in multiple really high crime areas. And every time there was a stranger rape, everybody freaked out. Because the news covered it, because there was the perception that there was a higher risk. When stranger rapes are so rare compared to being assaulted by somebody you know. And so we spent a lot of time at neighborhood meetings, at community meetings, educating people, because the knowledge corresponded with a perception of threat that wasn't accurate. And so I'm going to suggest, based on my experience, that with this policy in place and with trained partners, that the perception of threat is not accurate. Or at least the perception of a heightened threat.
So I've heard a couple of people say there's no policy right now. And between the time we look at this and decide that either this or some form of this is the policy, what do we do if someone comes in and wants to join the church? And this is putting maybe not you on the spot, but Luke and members of the board. I guess what's the policy now between this point in time and when something is agreed upon?
I'll reply to that in a personal capacity, not speaking for the church, but I believe that that's happened in the past. I'm aware of one instance, and I think that the church was really in a quandary because there were no guidelines, there was no path defined. So in my mind, we might face a situation here where the perfect is the enemy of the good, and we probably need a starting point. And if you tell me that this is a reasonable starting point, I take that very seriously. I do want to ask one other question. So any person recognized as an offender has rights to privacy. I'm not seeing that we are going to require that they surrender any of those rights. So am I correct in understanding that our leverage as a church with this document is if they want to be part of the community, these are the conditions, that's where we get some control over it?
Yeah, and so yes, absolutely. To answer your first question, if somebody comes in before this policy is passed, please just call me and I'll come and meet with y'all. I was training Vanderbilt University football team one time, and I was trying to train the coaches so that they would be able to respond to instances of their players doing inappropriate or criminal things. And I said, okay, now what are you going to do? And he says, I'm going to call you. And I'm like, no, that's not the right answer. But in this case, it is the right answer. I'm like, I just trained you. No, don't call me. But I think that I've known hundreds of offenders. I've worked with people in prison, in outpatient, in residential. I've worked with women, I've worked with men, I've worked with people who are 7 and 8 years old. I've worked with people who are in their 80s. I am very comfortable with this policy. In fact, I wasn't when I first read it, and I suggested changes, and the board made those changes. So now I'm really comfortable with this policy as a way to protect people. And the reason that I'm so comfortable with it is it requires that the offender be in offender-specific therapy with someone who understands the dynamics, who is trained to manage it, and by definition, that person and their probation officer, if that's the case, will have the same understanding of this external versus internal control, this relapse prevention. That's the state-of-the-art model right now. Actually, little known fact, I met my husband at a sex offender treatment conference 30 years ago. Little known fact. So I've been doing this for a while, and while I'm not like a super duper expert, I have presented at international conferences, and that's where I met my husband, actually. So I'm very comfortable with this policy.
So I've been a scout leader for 25 years, and every 2 years I have to go through youth protection training. And the goal of that is to create an environment that minimizes opportunities for sexual offenders to find victims. How does the church set up that environment to minimize those opportunities? I see that as the flip side or the other part of this policy.
Yeah, we haven't talked much about that, but I have been involved with many different churches creating curriculums that parishioners could go through so that way they have a heightened awareness and they understand some of the dynamics behind sexual offending, grooming, all of that stuff. I think it would be a great idea to offer that type of optional training for anybody who feels like it's something that they would benefit from. I also think that I imagine that the Unitarian denomination has mandatory training. Is that something you want to talk about? Most denominations do.
Yeah, I was going to say some of that happens at a professional staffing level of what requirements we have as religious educators and professionals for what training we have. Also at a very basic level, right? Folks may or may not know, depending on how they've been involved in the life of the church, of what we require. Like if you're going to teach in religious education, right? You know, we require a background check for anybody who's working with children or youth. policies to make sure that there's 2 adults in the room, there's no one-on-one contact, different things like that that are general safe congregation training things as well. But I think it's a great idea to expand the wider vision of this for how we're supporting people who are victims and survivors, how we are supporting institutional practices that limit potential risk is a great idea. I wanted to ask one question. We have just a couple minutes left. One conversation that came up among the board and the staff was wondering about how does this relate in your thoughts to some of the archaic laws in some states around the country that are defining, if you are letting your child go through transgender shifts, like you could be charged with some offense or neglect or even sexual offense, like some of these politicians will speak to those sorts of things. I'm curious thoughts about that and how this impacts or doesn't, or is completely different lane or different levels or whatever.
Yeah, thank you for asking that, because that is a very unfortunate media-driven and politically driven message, and it is not even remotely true. So the vast majority of people who commit sexual offenses are heterosexual. The vast majority of offenses are against opposite gender, whatever their victim profile is. There's a lot less offenses that women commit. There's a lot less offenses that gay people commit. And there is no correlation whatsoever with transgender or any sexual identity, any gender identity, and offending. In fact, the research actually shows that there's a much lower risk of offending. And the idea that, so let me explain it this way. For most offenders, part of the offense is sexual arousal. It's not a sexual offense. I mean, it's not purely sexual. It's a violent offense too, but there is an arousal towards violence, or an arousal towards children, or arousal towards whatever. And so it's just apples and oranges. There's a person's gender identity has nothing to do with their skewed arousal and intimacy. So while all people who commit sexual offenses have not been victimized, it's not a causal result. It's not like you're victimized and then you become an offender. We all know that that's not true. We do know that about 80% of people who commit sexual offenses were abused as children. There's actually a higher correlation between physical abuse than sexual abuse for men. As you get younger, there's a higher correlation to abuse. So like I worked in residential treatment with 8, 9, and 10-year-olds who had committed horrific sexual offenses. They came from all over the country to this one treatment program, and they were 100% severely, chronically abused. There are some adults who commit sexual offenses who are not abused, not many who commit sexual offenses against children, but sometimes who commit violent offenses against women because there's, belief systems and a lot of other things that impact that. That's more complicated than we have time to go over. But there's just absolutely not, I can't even, it is wrong to even talk about transgender identity in the context of this conversation, because there's no correlation whatsoever. And so thank you for asking, just so that we can dispel that right off the top.
Anything else to end with, Terry? Final
Well,
question?
y'all have just had really, really thoughtful questions, and I appreciate them. I think it's important that anytime something like this comes to the congregation that's so fraught with the potential for pain and misunderstanding that we do ask these really, really difficult questions. It's just essential. And over the course of the last couple of years, there have been many difficult questions asked, lots of conversation about, how do we do this in a way that protects individuals and honors the sacred personhood of everybody. And I just really appreciate being able to be here to answer your questions. I am committed to helping this congregation and its leadership do whatever is necessary to make this a safe, healthy, welcoming place for everybody. And I am available. I mean, you'll see me around. So if you have any other questions, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you.
Terry, I want to thank you. This is a really, really challenging topic that we have been wrestling with for at least 4 years now. And we had a lot of conversation at the board meeting. And finally, it came down to, I don't remember who said it, this is out there and we're safer with a policy.
For sure. Yeah.
I just can't believe how blessed we are to have your experience and your knowledge and your willingness to donate, give that to the church and help invest in this. I am just incredibly grateful for that, what you've done in the past and what you're willing to do moving forward, because I think that puts us in a really good place to handle any situation that may come up or will come up at some point. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're very, very welcome. I'm happy I could help.
Great. Thank you, Terry.